Hello, my name is Steve Simpson, and I'm a Salesforce certified technical architect and architect instructor. And I'm sharing with you my architect insights on this SteveTechArc.com website and YouTube channel. This video is in my integration series, and it is the Salesforce Tango, understanding the interactions between the client and server when making API calls. Here is a diagram where I'm showing you the dance moves. On the right-hand side, we have the server. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Salesforce being the server or whether it's an external server. If the web service does use OAuth, then typically there'll be a separate authentication server. So that's two endpoints. The server needs to be available through either directly through an IP address or through a URL, top level or subdomain. The server needs to have a listener process listening on a particular port. Typical one is 443 for SSL. Then if it is using the OAuth security protocol, there may need to be a second authentication server which performs the authentication and provides a session token that can be provided to the resource server. The server gets to define the protocol. Is it SOAP? Is it REST? Is it gRPC? Binary. If it is SOAP, the server needs to provide a WSDL file to the client. Server defines the contract. What are the methods? What are the verbs? What are the parameters? What are the return values? The server decides on the payload. Is it XML, JSON, binary? The server can only trace the incoming payload on the request, perform its own internal processing, and exit. There are no timings on full round trip, just server-side entry, server-side exit. And the server can just validate incoming payload, do its internal validations and internal processing. Now, if it is Salesforce as the server, the Salesforce will, to set up the OAuth, may likely need to have a connected app, set up an integration profile, and have an integration user. Switching to the left side of the diagram. The client needs to have the endpoint, the URL, or the IP address and the port to connect to. If OAuth is being used, the client may need to have the additional URL endpoint. The client would need to obtain a session token from the auth server and present it to the resource server. And the client needs to be prepared at any time for a session expiration error, catch the error, go back to the auth server and re-authenticate with a new session token. The client needs to call the appropriate protocol. For if it's SOAP, they'll need to import the WSDL. They need to call the appropriate methods, verbs, parameters, and handle the return values. And the payload, they need to be able to serialize the data correctly and handle return values in the appropriate payload type. The client tracing can trace the outgoing payload, the incoming response, and they can perform timings on full round trip only. They do not get server-side level details. The client can do connection errors, authentication errors, and server errors that are returned back. This is key. It needs to be returned back to the client, which is the server's responsibility, and overall response side errors. If we look at the API as an external client calling into Salesforce, we have the auth server, Salesforce's auth server, login.salesforce.com/services.oauth. We could have a SOAP client, which could be using Salesforce's enterprise WSDL or its partner WSDL. And these details I'll provide in a subsequent video. You could have a external REST client calling straight in, authenticating. The bulk API in large data volumes, large data either querying or ingest jobs. You could have the Apex SOAP, custom Apex. You'd have to import the custom Apex WSDL, Apex REST, hitting custom Apex web services on Salesforce core, the metadata, the tooling, or any number of other APIs, which I've demonstrated in a different video. You could be using the legacy streaming API for push topics, generic events, platform events, change data capture. Now you'll notice on the lower right side that Salesforce actually now has an external event bus, which has its own endpoint. And if you're calling the new PubSub API for platform events, change data capture, you would hit that API endpoint. And for calling into Salesforce, you most likely need to connect to that, integration profile, and the integration user. Now we're going to look at APIs and external server, Salesforce making calls out. Now in the top right, I've listed 3 common connectors to other Salesforce external clouds. Now I describe in an alternative video about the product party, how these clouds are not running on core, Salesforce Marketing Cloud Account Engagement, formerly known as Pardot, Salesforce B2C Commerce Cloud, and you have connectors that you can utilize. Since these connectors are configured on both ends, you can list those as double arrows. Going downwards, you'll see that Salesforce could make outbound calls. And if you're making Apex outbound calls to a SOAP server, you would need to import the WSDL and generate the Apex. You'd also need named credentials. If you're making Apex calls to a REST server, you would need named credentials. And if you're using external services to a REST server, you would need named credentials. If you're using the mechanism for outbound messages, you need to set up your outbound message config. You need to set up the outbound message endpoint and implement the WSDL that is actually generated from Salesforce. And if you're using Salesforce Connect, that is an outbound call to an OData server. These are all one-directional outbound arrows following the client-server protocols that I described. Now, Heroku Connect is more like a connector, so why set that up as bidirectional? Underlying, it is using what you never see or touch. It's using either the streaming API, the bulk API, and it's handling bidirectional communications. But because you don't configure that, you only configure the connector. That is why I demonstrate it as a bidirectional arrow. So to summarize, we talked about the detailed dance moves of client server, that the server responsibilities, the client responsibilities, and we dove into details if you had an external client calling into Salesforce or you had Salesforce calling out to an external server. And if you enjoyed this video, look out for other videos and please subscribe. So have a great day and dive into the tech buffet and keep feasting on tech knowledge. Stay nerdy out there.